In 1976, Bowie was living in Los Angeles. The city of so-called angels has always been a schizophrenic place, home to some of the world's greatest artists, but also home to all the excesses and temptations and degradations of fame and superstardom. It makes sense that this was the city of Bowie's darkest hours. Bowie was, I think, the kind of person who absorbed the spirit of the people and places around him. It was in Los Angeles, then, that the most chilling, the most cryptic, the most sinister of Bowie's personas emerged. The Thin White Duke. Station to Station, Bowie's 10th album, emerged from a confused and toxic miasma of drugs, paranoia, occultism, and crypto-fascist dreams. This was probably his lowest and darkest time. Bowie became obsessed with the occultism and spiritualism that was popular at the time and would draw satanic symbols on the floors of his home. His cocaine problem, which had always been a problem, it's not the side effects of the cocaine, I'm thinking that it must be love, was now out of control. He'd become a full-blown addict and he was visibly wasting away. He had always been thin, but now he was alarmingly, skeletally thin, and he apparently lived on a diet that basically consisted of milk and drugs. He was paranoid and deranged, often convinced that someone or something was following him. He gave several disastrous and incoherent interviews. He overdosed several times, and, perhaps most controversially, he made several statements that seemed to support fascism and Nazism. Oh, okay. One photograph apparently seemed to capture him giving the Nazi salute, though he claims the photograph simply caught him mid-wave. That seems likely. It also seems likely to me that the iconography and dark pageantry of fascism probably fascinated him, the same way the occult fascinated him at the time. The Thin White Duke persona that emerged at this time embodied and held together all these disintegrating pieces of Bowie. The Duke was sinister, cold, distant, formal. He dressed in white shirts and black suits. On stage, the lights were stark, everything drenched in harsh whites and deep shadows. Black and white chiaroscuro iconography suggested the deep fissures in Bowie's own personality. It's too late to be grateful. The European canon is here. The music had also changed. Station to Station is a formal masterpiece, a soaring experiment in vocal control and mastery. In the Ziggy era, Bowie's voice had been high, wavering, playful, sometimes almost nasal. On Station to Station, however, a deeper, richer voice develops. His range expands. His control deepens. The fact that he was gaining control of his voice at precisely the moment when he was losing it in every other aspect of his life is somewhat bewildering. Maybe it was the one thing he could control. There is very little sense of improvisation on Station to Station. On other albums, you can almost hear the improvisation and sense of play that usually dominated Bowie's recording. On other albums, you can almost hear the improvisation and sense of play that usually dominated Bowie's recordings. Not here. Tracks like the opening track, Station to Station, a 10-minute epic, or the album's best track, Word on a Wing, Lord, I kneel and offer my word on a wing, fully demonstrate Bowie's mannered control and range. In Word on a Wing, in which Bowie seems to be pleading with God, he sings, Lord, I kneel and offer you my word on a wing, and I'm trying hard to fit among your scheme of things. The voice he controls so completely stretches and cracks on cue, the prayer seeming to falter in desperation. And yet, it is hard to tell if the prayer to fit among God's scheme of things is actually sincere or a perfectly crafted performance that only gives the appearance of sincerity and sincere desperation. Major Tom and Ziggy didn't fit in. Does the Thin White Duke, or Bowie himself now, suddenly feel the need to fit in among anyone's scheme of things? In Golden Years, after all, one of Bowie's most famous songs, he is cool and aloof, his formal lyrical performance brilliant and smooth, no wavering, no desperation. Bowie had always been enigmatic, a sort of sign whose meaning was unclear. But now he was downright inscrutable, buried under layers of artifice. My sense of this is that the Thin White Duke was a sort of self-defense mechanism, a necessary, almost desperate front, a sort of shell of armor that protected the disintegrating Bowie. In Word on a Wing, he sings about this age of grand illusion. The grandest of illusions at this time, however, was Bowie himself. Even if the line between Bowie and Ziggy had been blurry, Ziggy had been a self-conscious creation, a deliberate theatrical choice. The Thin White Duke seems to spring unbidden, like the product of a psychological immune system desperate to fight off the corruption Bowie had embraced. And yet, Station to Station is one of Bowie's undisputed masterpieces. Bowie later claimed not to remember anything about the recording of Station to Station. He was apparently so high, so deranged, that everything about that time just went blank. He obviously needed another change, a new persona. He needed a new career in a new town, or he just wasn't going to survive. So, Bowie set off once again to change who he was.